Welcome to the latest installment of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. In this episode, we spoke with Darrell, author, political commentator, and CEO of Public Affairs at Ipsos. Bricker discusses challenges facing the CAF when it comes to recruitment and retention, as well as how these recruiting challenges will be complicated by issues such as declining birth rates, an aging Canadian population, and recent scandals. Bricker and I also discussed the issue of increasing polarization in Canadian society. Darrell, thank you so much for joining the CDA today. To start the discussion, I'd like to ask a question about Canadian Armed Forces recruitment and retention. What challenges does Canada's aging population and declining birth rate present for the CAF, especially considering its existing struggles with recruitment and retention? How can these challenges be overcome, and how is the CAF addressing them?
Well, there's two issues that really spring up as problems for the Canadian Armed Forces. The first one is finding people to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces. We're in a diversity for the Canadian Armed Forces isn't just about showing that your heart is in the right place and that you're representative of the Canadian population. The truth is you need to have diversity in your recruiting, not just from a skills perspective, although you could have that argument, but because the idea that you're going to be able to recruit young men from Atlantic Canada to do what needs to be done on our ships, there aren't nearly as many of them as there used to be. And so you're going to have to be looking at young women. You're going to have to be looking at new Canadians. You're going to have to be looking, I think, in the future about trying to retain people in the Canadian Armed Forces for longer. This idea that, people retire at 60 on full pensions and, that they're gone, all their experience is gone, is something that was developed based on populations that would only live till they were 65. Well, the average Canadian is now living to the age of 82, and many of us are living a lot healthier, a lot longer. So, I mean, there's a whole set of issues that relate to diversity, retirement policy, recruitment policy in the Canadian Armed Forces that have to be better aligned with the demographic realities of today. And I do find the conversations that I have with people who have these responsibilities that they are really on the horns of a lot of dilemmas here about how they manage it, because what we're talking about here is some fundamental changes to the way that the Canadian Armed Forces think about personnel. Now, the other thing is, nobody's going to want to go work in a toxic work environment, so you've got to get that cleaned up too. Because if you're going to want to recruit a diverse group of members to the armed forces, because first of all, it's the right thing to do, but it's also the necessary thing to do. Because as I said before, if you're looking just at young men from rural areas in Atlantic Canada, Quebec, and a few other places in the country, that's not the country anymore. So we're really going to have to take a serious look at what our HR policies are going to be going forward. And this, by the way, the CAF is really interesting and pretty unique, I would say, in Canadian society when it looks at its workforce, because they don't just talk about their full-time workforce. They, the people who are full-time members of the armed forces, but also, we have a huge reserve. Part-time armed forces as well. So there's going to have to be policies that we look at in terms of what makes sense for getting people into the reserves, because that's our force multiplier. And also it might be the place where we can focus some of these skills that are harder to find. Like, for example, IT skills and cybersecurity skills and, other types of things where people are amazing at what they do, but they're not that interested in going on parade. We're going to have a pretty serious rethink. By the way, we're not alone. Every armed forces in the world is going through the same problem. The only place that has a surplus of young people to populate armies these days, or armed forces these days, are countries in Africa. The rest of the world is going through exactly the same situation, some even worse than we are. So if you look at, Eastern and Western Europe today, their populations are in absolute decline. Canadian population is increasing almost exclusively as a result of immigration. We just recorded our lowest birth rate in Canadian history last year. I mean, 1.6. We're not even replacing our population. So if this portends a much more difficult recruiting environment going forward. John Ibbotson and I wrote a book called Empty Planet on this. And so if people are interested in, really truly understanding what's going on, we look at it all around the world. It's in 10 languages, so you can read it in, in whatever language you want to read it in. But really what it is just the shape and structure of population has changed over time. So through the Industrial Revolution, what basically happened, particularly after the end of the Second World War, when it really moved into sort of Industrial Revolution 2.0, is that we went through a huge migration of people from rural areas to urban areas, and this is globally. And when you change the way that people look at the process, why you have children, the motivation for having children, you change the number that they want to have. So lots of kids on the farm, lots of free labor, lots of kids in the city, lots of expense. So when you become an urban population, and Canada is an incredibly urban population, over 82% of us, or over 80, I think it's 81, 82% of us now live in a community larger than 1,000. 40% of us live in just 4 places, the 4 largest cities in the country. You start to have fewer kids. But the bigger thing is that, so there's an economic calculus, but then the bigger thing that comes on top of that is that it changes the lives of women. So when women move from the country to the city, they all of a sudden want to start obtaining educations in a greater levels than their mothers and their grandmothers did. Why do they want to have educations? Well, they want to participate in the economy, independently participate in the economy. And when they start doing both of those things, what it does is it pushes the age at which they get married to much later. So the average Canadian woman back in 1960 got married around the age of 21. Today, she gets married around the age of 30 if she gets married at all. 1960, she started at her first child, 21, 22, 23, and she had 4. Today, if she gets married at all, it's around the age of 30, and then 1 and usually done, but maybe 2. And only having 2 kids does not grow the population. You're simply replacing yourself and your partner. And the Canadian birth rate today, so if you need a birth rate of 2.1 just to keep the population stable, the Canadian birth rate today is 1.6. So we're half a kid short to even maintain the population that we have. So that's why people aren't having kids. Now, there's one other aspect to this. The other aspect is people feeling optimistic about the future. And everything that we said at the start of this conversation is mitigating against that. So the big crash in fertility, started since the 1960s, obviously, but we saw a big dip down in 2008 around the last economic crisis. COVID created another globally big dip down, and we're not picking up after that. Now that we're coming out of it, we're now moving into another period of economic uncertainty, and people have children when they're feeling hopeful about the future, and people are not feeling hopeful right now. So we're going, the decline in fertility is going to accelerate, because it's not like the children that aren't being born now are just waiting to be born later on. They won't be born. So this just builds on itself, and it's like a snowball rolling downhill, because every day the population gets older and less capable of replacing itself. So these issues are just going to accelerate, and they're accelerating really rapidly around the world. I'll just say one last point on this. The UN in 2017 put out their projections on the future of global population. They said by 2100 we're going to reach 11.2 billion people in the world. They just put out their most recent calculation model up to 2100. They're now predicting it's going to be down to 10.4. That's in 5 years, reducing their estimates by 800 million people. That's almost a billion. And by the way, they're way off on that. It's even less, even fewer. So this is going to be the one big issue that hardly anybody's talking about today that's really going to define a lot of this century, the collapse of global population. I think anybody who's watching this, and if you're in the CAF, if you're in the foreign policy community, actually becoming aware of what's happening in combination of in 2 areas. One, public opinion, and understanding that it is situational awareness for anybody working in this space, to understand actually what the people you're serving think and what they're concerned about and what they're focused on, will give you an awful lot of information about the political space that you're working in. And even if you're in the armed forces and you say you're nonpartisan and non-political, politics has a big effect on what's going on for you. And then the second thing, really understanding the demographic information that we were talking about before, because it's going to really shape not just things like recruiting, but it's going to shape where the crises are going to be in the world going forward, and what's happening in countries like China, Russia, the Middle East in terms of population are going to have huge implications for what you're going to be required to do to serve Canada's interests in the international space, and from a diplomatic perspective or from a military perspective. So even this little snippets that we talked about today, further exploration on those things, I think will make you one of the smarter people in the room about what the future is going to look like.
Is Canadian society polarized? And if so, where are the fault lines? How might you distinguish populist or populist-tinged political movements in Canada from other political movements seen in France, for example, or the UK and the United States?
I wouldn't say it's polarized in any more extreme ways than we've seen polarization in the past. I mean, define polarization. I mean, if you lived through the 1970s and 80s and into the mid-1990s in Canada, looking at Quebec separation, it was a fundamental defining feature of our national discussion. That was pretty polarized if you look at it from the perspective of Quebec and the rest of the country. So it depends on what you want to describe as polarized. If you're talking about a left and right type of polarization, yeah, I think we're seeing more of that in the conversation. And the main reason is because of what I just said, which is when you remove the national unity question from the table, and Canadian politics gets focused on things that most other countries get focused on, which are things like the economy, the size of the state. In some instances, maybe there's some regionalism aspects to it. Class certainly, plays into it. Then you start to get, more of these normal types of differences emerging, and that's what we're seeing. If we're not preoccupied with the national unity question, it opens up this other type of conversation. I don't think Pierre Poilievre's any more a populist than John Diefenbaker was. I mean, there's not that type of edge that we see being created in other parts of the world around the question of the future of the country and the direction of the country that has been assumed by the populist side of the political discussion. There's the character of it in other places is certainly different than what we're seeing here. I mean, social media is obviously part of the tactics. Populism itself. I mean, when we look at that, it's really not a thing other than it is a political strategy. It's a set of political tactics. It's a political strategy that somebody decides to adopt. This idea of us against them. That kind of a positioning. But Poilievre is not does not fall into the categories that are really the animating elements of populism in other places, which really relate mostly to cultural change, social change driven by immigration. So, I mean, the populist outbursts that we've seen in places like, for example, even most recently in Sweden, France, Germany, Italy, right now, what's going on in Italy, the United States, certainly under Donald Trump, this idea of cultural change taking place as a result of demographic change was a really animating part of the discourse and the strategy for people who are working on the populist side. I don't see Pierre Poilievre doing anything really that radically different from what Stephen Harper did, which was, I'm opposed to the Laurentian elite. I'm opposed to the governing class of Canada, and I'm one of the outs, bringing another voice to that group of people who've dominated our Canadian politics. And I see Pierre Poilievre as really in that vein. I mean, so for example, on issues like immigration, he doesn't vary really from the other parties on this. On the issues of, for example, a woman's right to choose, and so things that would normally be defined as social conservatism, he really doesn't fit that right wing type of ideology you would see in the United States. His opposition is to the CBC. And okay, well, they're opposing the Laurentian elite, opposing the Laurentian elite institutions, and that's not that different from what Stephen Harper was doing. So, yeah, I'm not lighting my hair on fire about a populist revolution in Canada, because I just don't see what I see in other countries. And I think the problem, Josh, is that people are not particularly well informed about what is happening in other countries, and they simply take rhetoric that seems easy to apply to the Canadian situation and do it without really appreciating that rhetoric doesn't necessarily apply in the same way. we don't have red and blue states in Canada the same way. I think there is a certain amount of disagreement between, for example, the downtowns of our major cities and the rest of the country. I mean, I think that that's true. But this is something that John Ibbitson and I wrote about in The Big Shift. I mean, it's not really a new thing. And I think that there are some politicians, and Pierre Poilievre being a good example of this, who really understand it very well and know how to play it. And you could describe that as being polarized, but it's not, that all of a sudden all Canadians are really, opposed. There's a big segment of Canadians that are defining our politics that are really opposed to immigration, which is one of the things that really defines populism in other places. Are they opposed to what they see as a ruling class that doesn't understand them, and are they frustrated by that? Yes. Okay. Could you define that as polarization? I guess maybe you can, but it's not really values driven. It's not the same thing that you're seeing in a place like France, for example. So I think we need a different type of maybe rhetoric or language to describe what's going on in Canada. But I do see it of a piece. I mean, this is really the result of the demography of the country changing and the psychology of the country changing. So, until probably the turn of the millennium, Canadians were fairly deferential towards their national institutions. They were fairly deferential towards, our legal system as it was defined. They were fairly deferential towards expertise. That's declining to a certain extent, which leads to more questioning of what our governments are doing on our behalf. I mean, a part of the problem is that our national government is so completely centralized and so basically of itself in this strange place called Ottawa. Really one of the only bilingual parts of the entire country where they see bilingualism as being a defining element. The only place where you can have an entire career in government from the beginning of your professional career to the end, and the people never change. I mean, there's this really it's almost like a clergy in our public service that stays there and never goes anywhere else and doesn't really talk to anybody else. But we've got a national, we've got a governing system in this country, our federal system, that kind of promotes this type of situation. But since we've removed the discussion over national unity, which, as I said before, was the big defining element of what our previous politics was, right back to the time of our founding, it's opened up other types of conversations, and that's what we're having. Would I describe it as populist? Not in the way that Bolsonaro is populist in Brazil, or Obrador is populist in Mexico. And you could go leader by leader by leader by leader. Maybe the thing that they have in common is this opposition to the governing elite, that healthy, some people would argue healthy, some people would argue unhealthy, consensus of the moderate left and the moderate right who kind of agreed on everything. And they governed the country, and the rest of the country deferred to them. That's where you're seeing the opposition. So is that populist or is it anti-elite? What is it? It's a little difficult to say. Is it real? Yes, it is.
Ipsos indicated that 46% of people polled didn't support the tactics of the Freedom Convoy, but sympathized with the frustrations of the movement. This number is even higher for Canadians aged 18 to 34. However, 54% of Canadians did not sympathize with the movement. Why did young people appear to be more sympathetic to this movement, and on what grounds did the truckers and the general population align?
I think that there's a couple of elements to this. One of them is the question really was, do you sympathize with their frustration? And I think that what we're seeing these days is about frustration. It's this sense that, Canada's best days may be behind it. The younger generation not feeling that they're going to live up to their potential, their parents feeling that the younger generation is not going to be able to live up to their potential. I mean, one of my favorite stats on this, Josh, is, if you're between the ages of 18 and 35 in the Greater Toronto area, 50% of them, live at home with their parents. I mean, this inability to move into kind of real adulthood is really frustrating for the younger generation. So there is a sense of that. But the other thing is, and what was interesting is this is the same group that aligns itself with the cause like Black Lives Matter and worried about equity and all those types of issues that have been so prominent with this particular national government. You know, they also look at tactics like what we saw in the truckers movement, as if not the content of what they were saying, as being okay. Well, that's kind of more of an acceptable type of way of doing things. They're not necessarily as respectful of law and order for political expression as maybe some of the older generations. So I think it's really those two elements. I think it's just this general, you know, overall sense of frustration about not being able to make progress and feeling like their future is being denied. So they're upset. And then the second part is saying, you know, maybe this is more of an acceptable form of demonstrating your disagreement with government than older generations might feel. The things that we do to really change things in this country are elections. And the problem with the younger generation is they don't participate at the same level. They can when they feel inspired, when they feel that the election is of consequence and that there's potential for change, as we saw for Justin Trudeau back in 2015. You know, they can come on board with a candidate that they support, and they can really have an influence. But it's like a Halley's Comet in politics. It, you know, comes around. You know, maybe it's there, but it doesn't come around very frequently. So yeah, the younger generation, the potential for a generational schism in this country is definitely there. But I wouldn't just look at it as people, you know, who are 25. It's also people who are 45. And that's one of the things that's really changed in what we're seeing in public opinion, is those people who are in that situation in which they should be achieving their middle class goals, you know, home ownership, stable relationship, raising families, making investments, preparing, you know, feeling like they're going to be able to retire successfully in a career and job that they think is stable, that will that they're happy with. That group ahead of the younger population. So it's not just the younger groups. That group is the one that's really most interesting to observe right now, because it's the aspirational middle class. So people who aren't just young folks just trying to sort things out, but that aspirational middle class who feels like they should have been able to afford the home in the neighborhood that they want to live in, that doesn't feel like they're ever going to have access to that. So that you got these two groups that are out there saying, you know, what's going on right now isn't working for me. And that's when you talk about, you know, people who are more disruptive types of politicians, like potentially Pierre Poilievre that's who he's speaking to. That's where his potential is.